The air hung heavy with an unnatural chill as Marlowe approached the twilight sepulchre, the ancient temple looming against a sky of endless twilight. Long ago, this half-destroyed temple had served as a passage between the world of the living and the underworld. Now it was a place abandoned by all but the most desperate souls, its cracked stone walls tangled with thorny vines and cloaked in mist. Marlowe could feel the weight of countless forgotten spirits lingering in the shadows, their whispers just out of reach. The grey fog clung to their boots as they took each step forward, with Selene and Nyx close behind. Marlowe knew what they sought, the throne of the forgotten, an artifact said to hold immense power over the dead. But the journey to reach it was filled with dangers, both seen and unseen. Selene, her cloak pulled tightly around her, glanced at Marlowe with her pale eyes reflecting both fear and determination. She had always been the one to see beyond the veil, sensing what others could not. "Do you hear them?" she whispered, her voice barely rising above the murmur of the wind. Marlowe nodded, their eyes fixed ahead. The whispers grew louder with each step they took, like voices of long-dead mourners echoing through the ruins. Nyx, the quietest of the three, moved with a grace that belied their strength. The shadow of a blade hung at their hip, and their sharp eyes scanned the darkened hallways of the temple for any sign of movement. They were the group's protector, though what they were up against was far from any mortal foe. The temple's interior was colder still, the chill biting into their skin as they stepped through the archway. Faint light filtered through the cracks above, casting eerie patterns across the floor. Marlowe paused, their eyes narrowing as they took in the faded carvings on the walls, images of a long-forgotten kingdom, its ruler sitting upon a dark throne. The depictions were worn, the details eroded with time, yet they conveyed a sense of authority and sorrow. The throne, their destination, was more than a seat of power. It was a monument to the forgotten, to those whose names had been lost to history. Marlowe knew that if they succeeded, they might change everything, but failure could mean joining those nameless spirits. Nyx moved ahead, their eyes alert as they scouted the next chamber, the shadows deepening as they progressed further into the sepulchre. The walls seemed to close in, and the whispers turned to low wails that tugged at their minds, the sadness almost palpable. "We shouldn't linger here," Nyx murmured, their voice betraying an unease they rarely showed. Marlowe pressed forward, their resolve hardening. They had come too far to turn back now. The throne was close, and with it, the power to alter fate, to reclaim what had been lost, to end the suffering that haunted these lands. As they reached the heart of the temple, a great hall stretched before them, its ceiling lost in the shadows above. At the far end stood the throne of the forgotten, carved from obsidian and adorned with symbols no longer understood by the living. It exuded a cold power that seemed to pull at Marlowe's very soul. Selene stepped beside Marlowe, her eyes locked on the throne. "This is it," she whispered, her breath forming a mist in the cold air. Marlowe took a deep breath, their hand tightening around the talisman at their neck. They had made it this far, but the real test was only just beginning. With every step closer to the throne, they could feel the eyes of the spirits watching, waiting to see if Marlowe would be the one to break their chains or join them forever. Marlowe, Selene and Nyx moved deeper into the heart of the twilight sepulchre, their breaths visible in the cold, stagnant air. The further they went, the stronger the whispers became, an ever-present reminder of the spirits that lingered here. The walls seemed to shift and close in on them, the air growing heavier as if the temple itself were aware of their presence. Marlowe kept their focus on the path ahead, their fingers brushing against the worn talisman at their neck. The weight of their mission bore down on them, but they knew they had to continue. The throne was close, and with it, the promise of power to change everything. As they entered a vast chamber, they were met by a sight that stole the breath from their lungs. An ancient bridge, suspended over an abyss that seemed to stretch endlessly below. The bridge was broken in places, its stones worn and crumbling, with the dark void beneath swallowing any light. Selene hesitated, her eyes widening as she stared at the seemingly insurmountable crossing. "We have to go across," Marlowe said, their voice unwavering. Nyx tested the first few steps, their footfall echoing in the silence. The creaking of stone and the emptiness below made every step a test of courage. But they knew there was no other way forward. Halfway across the bridge, the ground beneath them trembled, a low rumble reverberating through the chamber. Marlowe grabbed Selene's arm to steady her, their eyes darting around for the source of the disturbance. Nyx drew their blade, their gaze narrowing. Shadows shifted at the edges of their vision, and from the darkness emerged figures draped in tattered robes, the forgotten spirits taking on form. They moved slowly, their faces obscured, their bodies seeming to drift rather than walk. Selene gasped, her fingers tightening around Marlowe's arm. "They're coming," she whispered, her voice trembling. The spirits advanced, their hollow wails echoing through the vast chamber, filling the air with a bone-chilling sorrow. Marlowe and Nyx exchanged a look. They had faced dangers before, but nothing like this. The spirits were not something they could simply fight. Nyx stepped in front, their blade raised defensively, while Marlowe glanced at Selene. "Can you reach them? Speak to them?" Marlowe asked, their voice urgent. Selene closed her eyes, her expression tense as she tried to connect with the spirits. The air around them grew colder still, a biting chill that seeped into their bones. The whispers became deafening, like 1,000 voices crying out at once. Selene's eyes snapped open, filled with both fear and understanding. "They want release," she said, her voice shaking. "They're bound here, trapped by the throne's power." Marlowe clenched their jaw, the weight of her words pressing down on them. The throne, their goal, was not just a source of power, it was a prison, binding these spirits to eternal suffering. The realization hit hard, but they couldn't stop now. "We keep moving," Marlowe said, their voice resolute. They had to reach the throne, not just for power, but now for something more. To free the forgotten, to end their torment once and for all. With Nyx leading, they pushed forward, each step carrying them closer to their uncertain fate. The chamber holding the throne of the forgotten lay before them, a vast hall draped in shadows, the cold seeping into their bones. At the far end, the obsidian throne loomed, adorned with ancient symbols that pulsed faintly with a dark energy. Marlowe could feel the pull of the throne, as if it were calling to them, whispering promises of power and the end of suffering. The spirits lingered around the edges of the hall, their ghostly forms swaying, their hollow eyes watching. Marlowe glanced at Selene and Nyx, a silent understanding passing between them. This was their moment of reckoning. As they approached the throne, the air seemed to grow thicker, pressing down on them, each step more difficult than the last. Marlowe's hand tightened around the talisman at their neck, their resolve unwavering despite the weight that seemed to crush their very soul. Nyx moved ahead, their blade at the ready, their eyes scanning the darkness for any movement. Selene stayed close, her gaze fixed on the spirits, her breath coming in shallow gasps. They could feel the spirits' sorrow, their need for release, and it drove them forward, each step echoing through the vast, empty space. When they reached the foot of the throne, Marlowe paused, the dark stone towering above them, the symbols carved into it glowing faintly. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices demanding, pleading, crying out. Marlowe felt the pull more strongly than ever, the promise of power almost overwhelming. But they knew what had to be done. They turned to Selene, who nodded, her eyes filled with fear but also determination. She stepped forward, her hands trembling as she raised them. Her voice barely audible as she began to chant, the words ancient and filled with a power that seemed to resonate with the very walls of the sepulchre. The spirits began to move, their forms shifting, drawn toward the throne as Selene's chant grew louder, her voice echoing through the chamber. The symbols on the throne glowed brighter, the energy within it growing, pulsating with a dark intensity. Marlowe felt the ground beneath them tremble, the power building, the air crackling with energy. Nyx stood at the ready, their blade glinting in the dim light, their eyes darting between the spirits and the throne. The spirits' wails grew louder, a desperate bone-chilling sound that filled the hall, their forms swirling around the throne as if caught in a powerful current. Just as the energy reached its peak, Selene let out a final cry, her voice breaking as the symbols on the throne flared, a blinding light filling the chamber. The spirits let out a collective wail, their forms dissolving into the light, their cries fading into silence. Marlowe shielded their eyes, the light almost too much to bear. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the light was gone. The throne stood before them, dark and cold once more, the symbols now dim and lifeless. The spirits were gone, their presence lifted, the air suddenly still. Marlowe took a deep breath, their heart pounding, the weight of what they had just done settling over them. They had freed the spirits, but at what cost? The throne still stood, its dark power lingering, a reminder of the price that had been paid. Silence enveloped the vast hall as the blinding light faded, leaving Marlowe, Selene and Nyx standing before the darkened throne. The air, once filled with the agonized cries of the spirits, was now eerily still. Marlowe let out a shaky breath, their hands still trembling from the surge of energy. The obsidian throne stood before them, its power seemingly dormant, yet a sense of unease lingered. Selene sank to her knees, exhaustion etched on her face, her hands falling to her sides as she tried to catch her breath. Nyx remained vigilant, their blades still in hand, their eyes darting around the room as if expecting the spirits to return at any moment. Marlowe moved to Selene's side, helping her to her feet. "We did it," they whispered, their voice a mix of relief and uncertainty. Selene nodded, her eyes meeting Marlowe's, a tired smile playing on her lips. "The spirits are free," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. But even as she spoke, her gaze drifted to the throne, her expression darkening. The power that had once bound the spirits was still there, a silent reminder of what they had faced. Nyx stepped closer, their eyes narrowing at the throne. "It's not over," they said, their voice low. "The throne may be dormant, but its power remains. We need to make sure no one else tries to claim it." The trio moved away from the throne, their steps echoing through the empty hall. The weight of their journey pressed heavily on them, the realization of what they had done settling in. They had freed the spirits, but the throne still stood, a dark temptation that could easily fall into the wrong hands. Marlowe's thoughts were a storm of emotions, relief, fear, and a lingering sense of purpose. They had come here seeking power, but what they had found was something far more profound. They exchanged a glance with Nyx and Selene, a silent agreement passing between them. They couldn't leave the throne unguarded. As they made their way back through the temple, the whispers that had once filled the air were gone, replaced by an eerie silence. The oppressive weight that had pressed down on them seemed to have lifted, yet the sense of danger remained. The temple, once filled with the sorrowful presence of the forgotten, now felt empty, its cold stone halls echoing with the sound of their footsteps. Selene paused, glancing back at the path they had taken. "We can't let this place fall into darkness again," she said, her voice filled with determination. Marlowe nodded, their resolve hardening. They had a new mission now, to protect the Sepulcher and ensure that the throne's dark power would never be used again. As they stepped out of the twilight sepulchre, the twilight sky greeted them, the cold air biting at their skin. Marlowe took a deep breath, the chill a reminder that they were still alive, still standing. Selene and Nyx stood beside them, their eyes fixed on the distant horizon. The journey had changed them, and the weight of what they had faced would stay with them forever. But they had a purpose now, a reason to keep going. Together, they turned away from the temple, their steps steady as they moved forward. The throne of the Forgotten was no longer just a relic of the past. It was a burden they would carry, a reminder of the spirits they had freed and the darkness they had faced. And they would make sure that its power would never again fall into the wrong hands. The journey back to the edge of the underworld was filled with a cold, solemn silence, each of them lost in their thoughts. Marlowe could feel the weight of the talisman around their neck, its warmth now gone, as if it too had lost its purpose. The twilight sky above seemed endless, a reminder of the boundary they had crossed and the challenge they had overcome. Nyx walked ahead, their eyes focused on the path forward, while Selene leaned on Marlowe for support, her strength slowly returning. They knew they had freed the spirits, but the throne's dark presence still lingered in their minds, a silent reminder of the power they had faced. As they reached the border of the twilight sepulchre, Marlowe paused, looking back one last time at the shadowed temple. The sepulchre stood silent, its walls cloaked in mist, the weight of its dark history pressing down on them. Selene followed Marlowe's gaze, her eyes filled with both sadness and resolve. "We can't let this place be forgotten," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "The spirits may be free, but the throne's power remains." Marlowe nodded, their expression hardening. They had faced the darkness and survived, but their journey was far from over. They needed to protect this place, to ensure that no one else would seek the throne's corrupting power. Nyx turned to face them, their eyes sharp and determined. "We can't do this alone," they said, their voice echoing in the silence of the underworld. "We need to find others who can help us guard this place, people we can trust." Marlowe looked at Nyx, their eyes meeting in a moment of understanding. They had come here seeking power, but what they had found was a greater responsibility, one that required more than just their strength. "We'll find them," Marlowe said, their voice resolute. "We'll make sure the throne stays forgotten and that no one else falls to its darkness." The three of them turned away from the sepulchre, their steps steady as they began their journey back to the world of the living. The path ahead was uncertain, but they knew what they had to do. They had faced the darkness and emerged with a purpose, to protect, to guard, and to ensure that the mistakes of the past were never repeated. Selene glanced at Marlowe, her eyes filled with a quiet determination. "This isn't the end," she said softly. "It's just the beginning." Marlowe nodded, a small smile playing at their lips. Together they walked on, the weight of their mission pressing down on them, but their hearts lighter with the knowledge of what they had achieved. As they reached the edge of the underworld, the twilight sky gave way to the first hints of dawn, a pale light breaking through the darkness. Marlowe looked up, their eyes reflecting the soft glow of the coming day. The throne of the Forgotten was behind them, its dark power contained, but the memory of what they had faced would stay with them forever. They had freed the spirits, and now they had a new mission: to ensure that the throne's darkness would never again cast its shadow over the living. With Selene and Nyx by their side, Marlowe stepped into the light, their heart filled with hope for the journey still to come.